interruptions here. My late grandfather was a foreman, and yeah, he understood the law, right? The law of the community and how to go about it. And I didn't exactly draw lessons from that, but I learned that there was a system in place. So I dug deeper and I found out that there was a, and they also had like this system where they connected and where they would come and discuss social disputes, social issues, and such things. This was the older generation. Now it's more government influence. Now it's more governors, councillors, and so forth, most of whom are appointed by the president and might not reflect the communities they serve. I thought this was sort of like an isolated problem, but it's a problem all over the continent. And the problem, one of the biggest problems with the continent, is that it is still perceived as a country. People speak about we need to do this for Africa, we need to do that for Africa. And that sense of paraphrasing usually means let's look at the places with the most populations and places that we might have receive a higher yield from. And it's unfair. It's unfair. It keeps countries isolated. Like there's the AU, but the AU isn't representative of the continent. It really isn't. It isn't like the European Union at all. It's more like a formality, right? So digging deeper into the African phenomenon, you have to look at why the apartheid regime was so successful. Now, here's the thing. The British colonized South Africa after the immigrants from Dutch immigrated to Africa, in search of a better life, and the British treated them bad. This is what they call is it the Boer trek or Boer Oorlog something? I'm not really sure about that, but I know the people suffered like the same conditions you saw in Germany, where people were malnourished, hungry, ribs showing. That's what happened. Now, when they were forced to leave their area where they stayed, they basically moved away from the controversial zones. But that move was also difficult. And in that move came that resolve and a sense of vengeance or protectionism, like we won't be wiped out. They started to form an identity, right? So as they started to group together and gain power, because they weren't really impeded by tribe, they ended up oppressing other ethnic groups, whom at first they walked together. When they first came, they walked together. They learned about the landscape, the farming, and everything from these people. They actually walked together. But then that turned sour due to the bitterness from all of that. And as they began to develop, uh, the one thing that they knew was important was human capital. They started to teach their people in the language they can understand, which is Afrikaans, right? They started to translate scientific terms into Afrikaans so that people could understand them. And from that sprang this moment of enlightenment for that group, right? And they were advancing, and eventually when they came up with the apartheid system, they had the power to do so. And the apartheid system was a protectionist system, not necessarily, as most people think, to keep out the blacks and the coloreds and so forth. No, it was to make sure that even the most unskilled Afrikaner had a paycheck that he could live by, right? So it went on, and eventually it became harder as the checks and balances. It becomes harder, skill becomes a necessity, and where you find skill, you start to become pragmatic. Businesses are essentially what started to change this perception of division, because it was lose everything that's been worked for, or scrap this system. Like, most of the higher ups weren't necessarily as racist as most people think. It was the underlings. There's a group in South Africa, a poor society, who blame black people for everything. They took their jobs and so forth, but they have absolutely no qualifications. And this lady was offered a job to go and be a maid at a black woman's house, and she said she'd rather die, even though her kids were there and they are struggling, right? So this just shows you that the indoctrination was necessary so that on the ground they could have this societal barrier. They had the societal barrier on the ground, and these people, a mechanic can think he can intimidate a black lawyer, right? That's what was going on. And they developed a pretty powerful army. It was the most, or maybe still is, the most powerful army in Africa, and a lot of their weapons were built in South Africa, custom, right? So they had their own hardware, and they had nuclear capabilities. I mean, they have nuclear plants in South Africa now, and that's just a sign of them having mastered that technology, which isn't easy to do. So South Africa should actually be a country that has had a lot of progress by now. It should. But I think and I'm using South Africa as an example for Africa, to individualize it and not categorize it, because you can't compare South Africa to Nigeria, right? So you have South Africa, it has its history, it was racial and so forth, and they try to patch it up, almost like whisper racism, or just walk with them, right? As long as they are not in your house and so forth. The younger generation is kicking this stuff away but it's difficult because their families start to um, you know notice, and the tribal differences are also apparent, where you would have a Xhosa who would feel, I would never marry a Zulu man, right? So ethnic biases, and that coupled with the racial biases is basically this one great mess. And the rand should have been strengthened, right? It should have been strengthened or kept at that same level after the transition and the end of apartheid, but instead it fell. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but the rand was very powerful. Joburg, the city of gold, it was called the city of gold for a very good reason, right? It was the nerve center of South African economics, right? And now it isn't. Now, I think 3-4 years ago, it was the most violent city in the world, on this planet of 7 billion people, right? So Africans, not just South Africans, we tend to fear change and development because we don't want to leave our traditional norms, which were social norms, but they just don't work. You have people that say, I prefer this method because it has worked for me, or I prefer to do things this way because it's worked for me. That isn't how the world is working, and people are more informed now. Beautiful speeches and rallies and so forth aren't really enough to convince people anymore about the seriousness of their current situation. And the question of why is Africa backwards? Is it because of the West? Blame the West or blame the East? No, it's because there is this fear of sending out the best you have, not the best you think, right? Your close proximity, your patsy, the people around you, because you want them to succeed. No, literally a pragmatic choice to take the best out of the bundle and have them do the necessary negotiations. And that just doesn't happen. And the fear that we haven't yet reached the industrial age, while we don't need the industrial age. Saying Africa should start up car manufacturing companies and that would be progress. No. Who would buy those cars? The people in the country? Maybe. Or would they be exported? Will they meet standards of companies that have been here for centuries? It's pretty difficult. So the best way I see forward, and what I think limits us, isn't only the fact that we take for granted how we battle with the world, but we take for granted our own value of the people, And that's why you have so many brutal wars still raging, you know, civil conflicts. That's why we still have um, people who literally ban uh, any form of change or accepting new societal norms. And that's completely bad. So we cannot replicate what the West has done or the East has done and so forth. We can't replicate that. The only thing we can do is assess our problem internally first before asking for any assistance. If you look at your problem internally and you try to find solutions, then help would be add value. It won't be charitable, right? And of course everybody feels entitled because everybody feels like I can do this or I can do that, or this small kid should shut up, he's so entitled. Maybe, you know, it's all his dad's things or something like that. No, this started and I pursued it, and it wasn't easy. It hasn't been easy, and it shouldn't be easy, right? So this is the platform, and it isn't just free advice. I know I'm literally talking to global leaders. You know, that's very humbling, but at the same time you feel a lot of pressure. But in the same vein, you still want to get the word across that you think is missing, right? So history should be buried. White Africans are former immigrants, just like you would find an Irish American or Greek American and so forth that have immigrated there, or Muslim British who have immigrated there. They are immigrants and they've been here for a long time. So in order for us to get into the land issue and discuss it, which has been this, let's talk about land, let's talk about land and so forth, you know, in order for us to get to that, we have to look at what exactly forced people to start talking about that. What are the social constraints and economical hurdles that lead to such fears? And these fears are real, and I acknowledge them and accept that they are real. You know, I've met a lot of people, a lot of disgruntled people, people who feel or who only have one type of skill and are abused. And in my own way, I want to help, but it's difficult because I don't believe in freeloaders. And I've met a lot of people who are like that. They are freeloaders. They just want to get how they can get and get on with life. Whatever they take from you, they take. That's freeloading. And we can't be freeloaders to the world collectively. What is our contribution apart from the complaints that we don't own the rights to our mineral resources. Like nationalization is seen as a taboo. What about renewing licenses? What goes on there? When people renew these licenses for other people to operate in their country, Facebook is now going to open up in Britain, going to spend 500 million US dollars because they see a base there. They saw a base in India, but it was a different type of base. It was more foundational, right? So these are the sort of things that need to be looked at. I am not against charities. I think charities are good where they work. You know, if you contribute to a charity and you know for a fact that this is a charity that actually does those things, then there is absolutely nothing wrong with it. Foundations focus more on the societal aspects as well as the economical aspects. Charities are more economic relief. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why a majority of African countries find themselves in this hole or feel like they are being ripped off. It's because they haven't looked at home and fixed the issues at home. You know, you have to look at your country and say, what's wrong in this country? How can we fix it? And then you do that, but you don't make it exclusive. You literally don't make it exclusive and say, no, only older, people with gray hair should come. No, you involve a lot of people. You use all of the platforms that you can to reach out to people so that you don't so that it's not exclusive. And then after gathering all of this information, then you come up with solutions and you debate the solutions and they debate the solutions. And after that you can start looking at, okay, do we need to invest in this? How much will we need? You look at your budget, you start to you look at whether the community can actually get by in trying to do that, and then you can ask for for the IMF to help, because you have started a progressive trend, something that will keep moving. So let's celebrate the big innovations, as they are called, but the small ones also matter, right? And that's why most people's opinions matter. And with Namibia, the land issue I just described, it's about immigration. You don't want a certain group to feel isolated. You don't want that, right? It's stirring the pot. Except that they are immigrants, or the offspring, to be honest, the offspring of immigrants, right? Then you can start to look at how can we solve this and that. And I already spoke about the whole housing issue, that it's much more complex than people think it is. and I hope I can talk about it later when the lights come back on. Um, not only what led to that, but what is the actual solution that will work not only for 2016, 2017, 2019, 2020, 2021, but that will also work for 2030, 2040, and so forth. That's my Monday. This is Monday.